Welcome to the Target and Ownership Report for Week 5. I'm Jason Gilbo at JGilbo11. With me is Ricky Sanders at R Sanders DFS. Taking a look here, it's Thursday. You and I were just kind of talking before. You wrote this up on Monday night, Tuesday morning, so we get a little bit of a couple injury news to kind of get out of the way here first.
Yeah, let's start with Ebron. I don't think he's playing. He had a matchup that I liked mostly because of the price tag, but that's pretty much over. And now Julian Edelman's popped up on the injury report. It doesn't sound like Gronkowski's going to be 100% healthy. So I think we should take those with a grain of salt. Maybe we can talk about some backup plans as we get there.
Yeah, definitely. We'll get into some of the guys who we know are playing this week, and one Le'Veon Bell who came back last week and looked healthy, looked fine, saw a monster amount of snaps.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are going to be on Bell. I can't hate on it, whatsoever. Guy made a nice day out of last week, which was kind of a little bit quiet at first. Then he had that big run at the end to kind of put him over the top. He lines up as a wide receiver. He lines up in the backfield. He even had one snap at tight end last week, so he's all over the place. I think my preference this week is to go cheap it back and go really expensive at receiver, and you can even load up. You can use four solid receivers, but there are different ways to do it this week. So it's hard to ever make a case against Le'Veon Bell when he's healthy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, he's just one of those guys who's kind of an elite play week in and week out. You look at Gurley here next, who, I mean, his price has come down across the industry really over the last week.
Yeah, and what I like about Gurley is they finally started getting him involved in the passing game. I mean, he caught all five of his targets last week for 49 yards. So if we're talking about DraftKings and fantasy draft now, that certainly bolsters his value where he was already kind of usable on, FanDuel where it's not quite as important. But now if he's going to be involved there, I like the matchup this week. His price is pretty much the lowest it's probably ever going to be. So I think this is a week that, you could use Gurley in cash games. I still think it's a little risky. I still think he's, inefficient for my liking. With that being said, the workload's there, but there are some guys in kind of a similar situation who have actually been better to this point down the list that I'm more comfortable using. But Gurley is a guy that I'm going to be focusing on in tournaments this week.
Yeah, I definitely am too. I think that discount gives me a little bit easier feeling kind of locking him into a lineup. CJ Anderson, you talk about here next. Looks like Trevor Siemian might play. You had him chalked up earlier this week, is probably not. Does that change anything for you?
A little bit. I think he's the focus of the offense regardless. Obviously, there's a little bit less pressure on him if the opponents respect the passing game, and Simeon's been at least average, if not better than average to this point. So you got to feel good about that. And the Falcons pretty much bad against everything on defense, including running backs. They've allowed the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 most fantasy points to the position. Anderson's a workhorse. He's involved in the passing game. So another guy who's just cheaper than the elites, which, you could get some similar production, hopefully, to at least a Gurley for a similar price. So I like him. Again, I'm going to keep reiterating. We're going to get to the next two guys. Those are the way I'm going this week.
Yeah, we'll jump into kind of the value here. Jordan Howard, who's coming off a nice week against the Lions, now is getting a Colts defense that's pretty banged up. Really hasn't been good either way. I like Jordan Howard a lot. It's kind of hard not to use him, especially in this matchup.
Yeah, Jordan Howard, his volume went way up last week and his efficiency stayed up. I think it was 4.8 yards per carry, which was his worst of the season on those 23 carries. So now we're talking about a guy involved in the passing game. Joik Bell only playing 4 or 5 snaps on the side of him. He's getting all the snaps. He's getting all the work. He's still cheap. He's got a great matchup. So really, what isn't there to like about him? Sure, his price went up. He's probably going to be one of the highest owned backs of the slate, but I don't care. Kind of like Melvin Gordon for the past few weeks. It's just when a guy is getting all this work and he's not priced like a guy getting all that work, you got to use him.
Yeah, I mean, especially with, you touched on the wide receivers that you want to pay up for, and that kind of helps get that going for you. Jerick McKinnon's another guy as well who can help. You look at that, I mean, you talked about 21 total touches in week 4, pretty safe number at that price.
Yeah, and 4 red zone touches, which is, always the worry with McKinnon is if we're going to roster him, is he going to get screwed at the end? Vulture's the word I'm looking for with Matt Asiata or, one of the other guys. But it looks like at least some of the time they're going to give him the option to. And now you add that to his, explosion and the fact that he's the passing that he's the one who catches the majority of the passes, and you got to like McKinnon, a guy who's priced even 1,200 cheaper on DraftKings than Howard. We're looking at two workhorse backs here for a combined price of 9,200. So that leaves a lot you could spend at both receiver and tight end. Again, I think receiver's the spot to spend it. If you go cheap at quarterback, now you can pretty much do whatever you want.
Yeah, definitely. We'll jump into the wide receivers here. I mean, we start off with some expensive guys. Antonio Brown, priced up pretty highly as expected, but gets a Jet secondary that's pretty much only name recognition right now. They are not good.
Yeah. I mean, Darrell Revis is banged up. We don't know if he's playing yet. Regardless if he does, don't care. Antonio Brown, we saw what Ben could do at home last week. And, Brown did score some touchdowns, but he didn't even have a great week besides that for him. Look for him to be even more the focus of the offense this week. I'm paying for him in cash games. It's a guy that I think you're going to really, really regret fading this week if you don't.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And then you talk about Jordy Nelson, who's my favorite, wide receiver, not named Antonio Brown, and he's also a little bit of a discount from Brown as well.
Yeah, so I've got 4 upper echelon receivers listed here. There's probably 5, assuming Edelman plays, that are all in the tier of guys that are, I have a really hard time fading. I mean, Jordan Nelson's one of them. Aaron Rodgers has kind of got that similar thing to Roethlisberger, to Breeze, to a bunch of quarterbacks in the NFL, where they just play better at home. And now you look at, a Giants defense that's looks to be somewhat improved, but I'm really not that worried when it comes to the Packers offense. Nelson looks like a true number one. They're targeting him in the end zone. There's just, again, like Brown, this is a wide receiver one spot for him. So there's not a whole lot to worry about.
Yeah, definitely. And then Brandon Marshall in that Pittsburgh game, it seems like there's a lot of positives kind of going his way this week. And one, I mean, I love his price really across all 3 sites.
Yeah, the price is ridiculous when compared to the other guys. I mean, I like Marshall. I know you just said you like Nelson. I like Marshall's price the best of any of these guys. I think Marshall's a true wide receiver one. I think this is one of those weeks that they're going to be playing from behind. He's going to see not just 10 targets. I'm projecting in like the 13 to 15 target type week. I think I got him 13 here. It could even be higher. So, Marshall, who seemed to excel last year in that 2 wide receiver role, now with Decker down, it's kind of back to just a Nunwa or Marshall, which is how Fitzpatrick was comfortable and how he succeeded. That was how Marshall succeeded. I think you're going to see a monster day. No one in this Pittsburgh secondary really scares me. They have been good this year, but I just think Fitzpatrick's just going to have to be throwing a lot. Forte hasn't exactly been good. Let's just put it that way. It hasn't been good over the last few weeks. So if he's ineffective, they're going to have to go to the passing game, and Marshall's a true number one, kind of like Nelson, kind of like Brown, and he's not priced that way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, volume-wise, I think Marshall's in for pretty much a lock this week. And, as you mentioned, the price is very solid. Julian Edelman's the guy you talk about next. He popped up on the injury report pretty much, within the last hour or so. I don't know. I mean, with the new injury report, we could see him go either way, but I think he should be okay.
Yeah, if he plays, I'm locking him in. If not, I'll swap to Chris Hogan and be fine with it. Honestly, I think Brady's going to make a wide receiver one this week in terms of PPR, in terms of DraftKings fantasy draft specifically. So if you're getting all those catches, you're going to want someone. I really want it to be Edelman. I love this price point. But if Edelman doesn't play, and let's say you're using Brady at quarterback, and you're already getting some Patriots exposure, I really like Jordan Matthews, who I think is this year's Eric Decker, to where his quarterback's playing some awesome ball. He's scored 70 or touchdown in each week. I think he's the cash game swap from Edelman. So, it's not the end of the world if Edelman doesn't play, but I really think Edelman's a better play than Matthews. But that being said, I'm fine rostering both.
Yeah, definitely. Matthews is a good call. I really like that as a pivot option. Dontrell Inman, you talk about here next, pretty good value guy. It seems like it's kind of a carousel between which Chargers wide receiver you want to use. And you seem to be kind of going, it's not necessarily contrarian, but I think he doesn't get the buzz the other two get.
Yeah, I mean, for Benjamin, especially a guy who's not playing very many snaps and being targeted the third most of these guys in the last 2 weeks. I mean, he's getting a lot of love. He's the most expensive. I don't understand it. I mean, I understand the case for Tyrell Williams. You look at the last 2 weeks, he's been targeted 4 times in the red zone. He's had the most targets, but Inman's kind of been the guy. I mean, he's been playing the most snaps. He's been right there in terms of targets. In yards per target the last 2 weeks, he's stepped up big time. I think he's over 10 during during that stretch, while Tyrell's at 6. So he's kind of been their big play guy after the first 3 weeks. He was only 2 yards a target. So it might have been an outlier game last week, but, Philip Rivers tends to lock onto a guy that he likes. So I was just arguing with someone on Twitter saying that this is unpredictable, kind of like Drew Brees. And I was like, when was the last time Philip Rivers was really that unpredictable? Vincent Jackson was his guy for a while. Gates was his guy for a while. Danny Woodhead. I mean, he kind of finds staples and relies on them pretty heavily pretty much every year. So I don't think this is really a quizzical offense. I think with what he's got left, it's Inman and it's Williams. I think more people are going to be on Williams. So I kind of see Inman as a nice pivot.
Yeah, definitely too. I mean, especially to exposure to that game. I think overall between the two passing attacks, there's going to be a lot of potential there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's one of the games that you want to target. I think Rivers is good enough. If Gordon can't get it going in the running game, which eventually one of these weeks Gordon is not going to score. And if that's the case, Rivers is probably going to be able to sustain 2 receivers. So it could be a week where it's both of them that get it done. And, people on both sides of the argument think they're right come Monday.
Yeah. Looking at tight ends here, Rob Gronkowski, you talk about, who may or may not be 100%. Is he still viable even as a GPP option if he's kind of got that lingering issue going into week 5?
Yeah, I don't necessarily believe the Patriots, so I think he's a tournament option if he's got that issue. But I think if he does have it and more reports come out suggesting, more and more pessimism, that Martellus Bennett enters the cash game consideration if you want to go that route. I mean, I'm pretty sold on Ertz and cash this week and pretty much Ertz most places. But that being said, a Patriots tight end is probably going to get his this week. If it's not Gronkowski, if this, only running 14 routes last week is actually because he's hurt, the fact that he's only caught 1 pass in the last 2 games is actually because he's hurt, then Martellus Bennett, a guy who led the position in receptions a few years ago, is going to have a monster day with Tom Brady. So one of these guys is going to be worth using, if not both. The question is in what format. If Gronkowski keeps hurting, I want Bennett in cash. I want Gronkowski in tournaments, and I probably want Bennett in tournaments too.
Yeah, I mean, talk about 2 opposite sides of the spectrum in terms of pricing as well. I mean, Bennett's pretty cheap on DK. I mean, he could be a viable swerve off of Ebron, who we talked about before, kind of in a similar price range.
Right, exactly.
So, Jordan Reed, you talk about next, kind of your next expensive pay up option to Gronk. I mean, we saw that finally that 2 touchdown game come last week, and we knew it was coming eventually. With the red zone targets for Kirk Cousins being rather low.
Yeah, both him and Olsen draw 2 of the worst matchups this week. Tampa Bay against Olsen's allowed the 4th fewest fantasy points, whereas Baltimore's allowed the 6th fewest. But I kind of have a man crush on Reed. I think he's the most talented tight end right now because Gronkowski isn't healthy. So I think he's kind of a guy who you can use in any matchup. It was only a matter of time till Cousins started targeting him in the red zone. Now that he has, I'm assuming that's a trend that's going to continue. It's one that needs to continue if this passing offense is going to be successful. So I don't think there's any reason to run away from this just because the matchup is difficult, because to me, Jordan Reed's the difficult matchup for this defense.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, we know the volume's going to be there with him. Dennis Pitt is an interesting one because I like him as a pivot. I think Zach Miller, Kyle Rudolph are going to draw a lot of ownership this week, but Pitt is kind of the contrarian guy that you named.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are worried about him after last week's 2 reception performance. It actually was 3, I think, because Crockett Gilmore kind of got, involved, but Crockett Gilmore caught 2 of 2 receptions. So I've heard people saying like, this is a committee now, but there were 5 targets to Pitta, 2 to Gilmore. Gilmore just happened to catch both of his. So I'm still not worried. Pitta was still the one running a greater percentage of the routes, and him and Flacco are best friends. It's a much better matchup than either of the guys that we just talked about. I think Pitt is going to be involved. I think he's a staple to this offense. If they cover either of the receivers, they've got some slow receivers. If Norman covers, Steve Smith or one of them, I think it's going to be tough. So I think Pitt is going to see more coverage by default because one of their sides is going to be shut down. So I think it's going to be a big day for him. Sorry, I just had a mental break. I was hoping I wasn't saying the wrong thing, but sorry, a message just came across mine. That's why I'm going slow here. All right.
Those Slack notifications, man, they get you.
Yeah. I was just making sure that I didn't have work to do. But yeah, Pitta is definitely a guy I think he's going to be heavily targeted. Norman, shutting a guy down. So Pitta, I think he's a cash game option, to be honest with you. If you're not sold on Ertz like I am because he's coming off a rib injury, I think Pitta is the guy to pivot to. And I also think he's worthy of consideration in tournaments too because of all the looks he's been seeing. I mean, he's way up there in terms of targets and catches to this point. It was one bad game. Let's not overreact.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely all in agreement there and kind of transitioning into Ertz a little bit. Really nice price tags, and the matchup really couldn't get any better.
Yeah, the Lions have allowed, what is it, 18 touchdowns in the last 20 games to opposing tight ends. Ertz, there's going to be some competition here with Trey Burton kind of emerging in his absence, but I'm not really worried about that. I mean, Ertz, throughout the course of his entire career, has been dealing with worse quarterback play and, splitting with Brent Selleck or whoever else was there. So I think in an elite matchup here, he catapults back to the top of the depth chart. He's the guy. They'll look for him in the red zone. Obviously, it's a way to beat the Lions. I think their running game is going to struggle here. They may end up using Darren Sproles more than any of them. It might be a lot of passing. And I think Ertz and Matthews are their move the chains guys. I think there's going to be a lot of volume. I think there's going to be red zone targets. He's my number one tight end per dollar this week. I'm really not straying that far from him.
Yeah, I'm not either. I think you look at the prices, you look at the matchup, everything kind of adds up. You did mention Ebron, obviously looking like he's not going to play, or it might have been confirmed already. Anyone in terms of kind of a value or a punt option that you might be looking at?
Yeah, I kind of like this Cameron Brate on Jameis Winston's team, the Buccaneers. There we go. We're looking for the name, but he's a guy who's been targeted at least 8 times each of the last 2 weeks. I mean, Winston's looking for him in the red zone, so I kind of like him. I mean, this volume's kind of come out of nowhere in terms of his talent. Like we didn't know who he was, but I mean, this is his role. I mean, with Safarian Jenkins getting cut, I mean, he's the true number one tight end. So really, we shouldn't be that surprised. And as long as he's, decent, which he's showing that he is, he's going to continue getting it done. Carolina pass defense last week was toast. I know it was the receivers, but Brate's the guy that Winston looks for in the red zone if he can't find Evans. So I think there could be some receptions here. There's obviously going to be a bunch of targets. I mean, 18 in 2 weeks is definitely eye opening. So if he's going to get the targets, if he's going to get some red zone looks at 2,900 on DraftKings, that's quite the value. If Ebron sits and you were going to go cheap, I think just go slightly cheaper to this guy, and it's the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's reports that Charles Sims isn't 100% healthy. I mean, we already know the Tampa Bay Bucks throw a ton, so that really does kind of add into, his type of volume.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, this is the guy I'm going to fit the other things in tournaments. If I'm going up to Le'Veon Bell or something like that, this is where I'm going to make it work with Brate. That's a guy I'm building around this week. I don't expect his ownership to be that high. I do think that most people are going to be on the tight ends that Gronkowski or Bennett or even some of the upper echelon guys in tournaments where you can get this guy at a very, very low ownership rate. I think, you go Le'Veon Bell, you go three monster receivers, you go Brate, you go quarterback with upside, man, you're looking good in tournaments.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's a way I think a lot of people are going to be going to kind of look and go that way because, as you mentioned, I mean, those receivers, I really want a piece of all of them. I feel like there's one too many that I can't get enough of.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of people are drawn to the workload for running backs. But as I've been playing DFS more and more, I really love receivers, man. I mean, you get a guy catching a 70-yard touchdown and doing other things. It's very unlikely that a running back breaks that kind of thing on a given week. Sure they could, but the value we're getting from like Melvin Gordon and certain guys like this are the goal line touches. But receivers can make an entire day on one long target. There's a bunch of, Jordy Nelson's a guy with a skill set like that. Antonio Brown's a guy with a skill set like that. Marshall's going to get targeted in the end zone multiple times. They're going to rack up the receptions. So, each time they do, it's like 10 yards rushing. I really like receivers in daily fantasy, especially this week. There are a bunch of backs in decent spots, but man, this is a receiver week for me.
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, is there anyone that kind of emerged to you, after you written the article?
There's a bunch of guys that are kind of borderline options. I like both receivers on Marshall and Anunwa. I'm on both of them. In terms of other backs, I mean, who do we mention here? Because I know there's a long list of mine. CJ Anderson. I kind of like Ezekiel Elliott as a tournament play. I don't think a lot of people are going to be on him because of perceived bad matchup, but his workload keeps going up and up and up. I think everyone's assuming that Theo Riddick is just done because all the reports are coming out on Zenner. His workload stepping up. Last week it was Dwayne Washington, but you really don't need him to be involved in the running game for him to have a productive day. I really like Theo Riddick to finally have a game, not similar, but similar in terms of fantasy points to week 1, where he catches a bunch of passes and actually breaks a long one. So yeah, there are some guys that have emerged since writing this. It's probably going to continue to progress as the week goes on. I mean, this injury report is getting extensive. And how about DeAndre Washington? Now that Latavius Murray is probably out, he's the guy that I've been on since preseason, and finally, hopefully, we get to see him get the workload and not give it up.
I mean, as if we needed another value to kind of go after for this week.
Right. And I actually think that if Murray is out, Washington is a cash play because he's even cheaper than McKinnon. And now, I know he's going to split with Jalen Richard, and a lot of people are on him. He had that 70-yard touchdown in week 1. But Washington's been the guy who I've had circled as the talent in this backfield and the guy that I think is going to run away with it. This is an elite offensive line. If he's seeing 17 to 18 touches around him, a plus goal line, I mean, he's McKinnon for cheaper.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a good call there and one to keep an eye on as we kind of head into Sunday. But if you want to check out the projections here that Ricky has, want to look at fantasy points, targets, touches, ownership, all of that, be sure to head on over to dailyfantasycafe.com and give that a look.